Our keynote speaker for the evening, Mr. Jeffrey Becker, the man who made bow ties sexy again. Let's give a warm round of welcome. Jeffrey Becker.
My pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Actually, it was Murray Rothbard who made bow ties sexy. I'm trying to think back. I think I was probably 16 when I put on my first bow tie. I was working in the clothing store, and they came in, you know, just in a shipment, and I asked about them. I asked if I had permission to wear one. It struck me as the right thing because, I don't know, regular ties just always got on my nerves. I mean, they're always flopping around and falling in your food, and you know, they just never seemed to set right well on me. So I tried the bow tie out, and it worked. It just stayed out of my way. That was it. What I didn't know at the time was that once you put on a bow tie, you're stuck, like for life. You know, like everybody will associate you with that forever. And I remember reading a book at some point that I'm trying to learn how to dress like a man. There was a book called something like How to Dress Like a Man by John P. Malloy. And he has a section in there reading along and everything seems sensible. And you're reading on, and you get to the later chapter, it says, what about bow ties? And the guy says, listen, never wear them to a job interview. They signal that you're a bomb thrower. And nobody wants to hire a bomb thrower. You know, like an anarchist. Basically, is what it meant. So that was my first exposure to anarchism, right? So there's been a lot of talk about Murray tonight. And I thought I would use this occasion to reflect a little bit on my life with Murray and some of his intellectual legacy and some of what he taught me. We have so many illustrious members of the audience here. Can you raise your hand if you knew Murray? Wow, okay, right. So Murray. Murray never quite leaves you. If you met him, you know him personally, you can't read the news without reading it through his eyes, hearing his cackle, thinking about the way he would look at things, you know? And I want to kind of give you a sense of who he was and what he believed. Because it's very sad to me in a way. Once a person becomes an iconic figure, they stop being a real person. You know, they just become a meme. And people start characterizing them any way they want to. I've seen it happen in the liberty world with people like Muse, you know, with Rand, with Murray. And people ascribed to him views he didn't hold. They didn't know his personality. They didn't understand his way he looked at the world. So maybe if I can tell you some stories about him a little bit, you can get a better sense of him. And then we'll work our way towards talking about the spirit of libertarianism, the aesthetic of liberty that I hope will form the basis of my talk tonight. I did write up a talk. Unfortunately, as I was estimating the time, it's about 3.5 hours, so I'm not going to... Did you ever do this? You write up a talk and, you know. So anyway, we're not going to do that. So my first exposure to Murray came when I was an economics student. I left Texas Tech University and went to a private program funded by the Douglas MacArthur Academy, which gave me free school and paid me a lot of money to go to school and everything. This is long before anybody had student debt. I mean, I can't believe it. Can you imagine? You used to be able to like work your way through school or get a scholarship and not have to pay for it, or you get paid to go to school. Different world. Anyway, I was sitting in this pompous professor's office, and he was an economic historian, and I looked up at his bookshelf, and there's this gigantic book that said Man, Economy, and State. And I thought to myself, I'm interested in all those three of those things. Why is this book so large? And I just asked him about it. And he said to me, don't read that book. It's by Murray Rothbard. He is an anarchist. And he expected me, as a 21-year-old kid, to go, oh, okay, I won't do that. Obviously, I didn't have anything better to do, so I went to the library and read it. And I had this impression of, I I don't know, like an epic figure. I don't know if you read the book, but it's a severe book in some ways. Because it seems to have all the answers. And then you put it down and you think, my God, this guy has got it all figured out. He knows everything. I'm sure he's a kind of a scary guy in some way. Maybe I shouldn't get to know him, but it was all respect, all respect. And I pictured him as like a giant in a sense. And it was the strangest thing when 2 years later I found myself at, I think it was a conference in San Francisco where somebody asked, could you go pick up Murray at the airport? I was like, what? Murray Rothbard? And you know, like I said, I think maybe I was 22, 23 years old, something like that. So he arrives, and he's this tiny little guy. He was about that big, you know, and he had this hilarious, high, squeaky voice, and a way of speaking that was so exuberant that you can't, it was like more exuberance than one person should be allowed to have. And so you feel like the need to take some of it away to normalize him in a way. But that makes you kind of crazy too. And if those of you who have been with him can remember what it was like to be with Murray, you never stopped laughing. It's like he had this weird effect on you where you would start laughing hysterically. You would sort of get weirdly smart around him and erudite, and you would want to stay up all night long. Which is what he kept a very strange schedule. He would go to bed at 5 a.m. and wake up at about 2, 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So you stayed up all night with him, laughing, and you just didn't want to go to sleep. And he just had this effect on people. It was just a funny and strange personality. I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like it. And you know, as I thought about it as the years have gone on, and he never changed. He was always the same way, just a level of exuberance. That would cause you personally to engage in behaviors you didn't know you were capable of, like drinking too much, not sleeping, laughing exuberantly to the point that your voice is sore, thinking thoughts you never thought you'd think, you know, for example. That was one of Murray's intellectual projects was to get you to he delighted in making you think things that you think you're not supposed to think, right? So, because he wanted to break through orthodoxies. It was extremely important. Sometimes it didn't even matter to him what orthodoxy was punching through. He just wanted to sort of break through it. He also had a way of wanting to extract information from you, whatever was in your head, which was a real challenge. He wasn't quite like didactic. He wasn't always like teaching you all the time. He wanted to find out what you knew, because he wanted to get that information from you, right? And he would be disappointed when you would run out, actually. I remember one time I was at dinner with him, and he was puzzling about the history of ideas and trying to understand like why Christianity in the East took on a certain form that was different from that which it took on in the West. One which Murray thought lent itself to the idea of material progress, and one which led to a kind of a static love of hierarchy. He couldn't understand the difference. And he said, Jeffrey, the only difference I can tell between Eastern and Western versions of Christianity is one word in the creed, Latin filioque, which means that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, proceeds from the Son. So Jeffrey, he asked me, why do you suppose the adoption of the word filioque in the Western creed might have led to a greater reverence for material prosperity in the West? And I'm sitting there just this young punk, you know, and feeling as if I'm supposed to know the answer, you know? And I said, well, Murray, so I reached very deep, and I said, well, I think it might have something to do with maybe a higher reverence for the incarnation. And he said, oh, that's very interesting, tell me more. I gotta tell him more? I told him already a lot. So I said, well, I'm just thinking, you know, that if you believe that God is capable of becoming man, then that shows a special kind of dignity to man himself. And so then Murray said, but that is very interesting. How does that specifically relate to the filioque clause? And then I thought, well, you know, he's about to discover I'm faking this whole thing, right? And I try to attempt an answer, and he goes a little disappointed in my third answer. And finally, I said, Murray, I'm sorry to say, I just don't know. He said, well, okay. And he was disappointed. I felt like I disappointed him, This is what he did. He got whatever information you had. And by the way, it didn't have to be on weird aspects of the history of Christianity or whatever. He wanted to know what you knew about soaps. He loves soaps. Soap operas, I'm telling you, like All My Children and whatever. You watched all the soaps? And hi.
Hey, Jeff.
Nice to see you. Oh my goodness. He watched all the soaps. He loved basketball. He loved jazz. And he would argue, too, about strange things. Like I told him, I said, I love Joshua Rifkin's versions of the early Scott Joplin works. And he said, Jeffrey, how can you say that? Joshua Rifkin ruined Scott Joplin. Those are the worst recordings I've ever heard. And I was shocked by this, And so we got into like this weird fake argument about it, I don't know. Murray had this, have you ever watched like really intense gamers play like some game on television? I'm not a gamer, but when people play games, they're all in, So if you can imagine that person playing the game, that was the way Murray that's the way Murray treated life. Like intellectual world. He played it like a big game. Politics was a game for him. The world of ideas in general. Just everything was for him just so intense, and he loved it more than anything else. And I think, as I think back on my 10 years of experience with Murray, that more than anything else is what I'm left with, was his tremendous love of life. And I think from that flowed his love of liberty. Yeah? Those were two things were connected in his mind. The freedom of individuals to make choices about their associations and their trades or their exchanges, what they want to do with their lives. The things that they love was very much bound up with how much he thought life was fascinating and beautiful and exciting and just lovely. And I think for him, this external, exogenous, inorganic thing we call the state, which Murray regarded as a kind of a band of thugs that has temporarily tricked the population into acquiescing to their power, essentially. And then once we sort of come to love life enough and love each other enough and get excited about life enough, then we'll just kind of figure out a way to make them go away. And I actually think he might be right about this. I think that actually we're seeing this right now. More and more. The more that we love our fellow man, the more we love our own lives, the more determined we get in our lives, the less power, in effect, the state has over our lives. And if we all do this together, eventually, this great project, which we call the total state, becomes an unviable project that will eventually collapse. So that's my rendering of Murray, and I find that that not everybody sees him the same way. And I don't entirely understand why. And let me just reflect on that a second. So one of the traits I tend to see among libertarians is not a joy and love of life, actually. Maybe you've noticed this. Oh, let me just back up a second. It was Murray's love of life that enticed me into libertarianism, right? So when I met him, I think I was a kind of Reaganite conservative, maybe, In fact, I'm sort of embarrassed to think about it. In 1984, I think I might have had some Reagan propaganda that I put on people's windshields at the grocery store or something. I'm not entirely sure about this. I have a vague memory of being a Republican political guy when I was a junior in college or something, or a senior in college. So I had to work myself out of that. And it was Murray that did it for me. And it wasn't quite Man, Economy, and State, which was a great book. And it wasn't so much my reading. It was a sense that, like, whatever Murray was taking, I wanted that same thing, you know? And it opened me up to his ideas. And gradually, over the course of, I guess, a year or two after I met him, he wore me down. Because basically Murray's view was that there's nothing about life, whether it's good or bad, or the market, whether it's perfect or slightly imperfect, or human relations in general, even if they're not always perfectly harmonious and wonderful, there's nothing that the state can do to improve upon what society itself can achieve. In fits and starts, however imperfectly. The state is never a solution to it. And so Murray's basic proposition, as I began to render it in my mind, was there is nothing that needs to be achieved in society that society can't achieve on its own, and nothing that the state can do to improve the overall results of life on Earth for ourselves or our communities that we can't do on our own. And if you come to that conclusion, the result is an uncomfortable realization. You're an anarchist, right? So I began to think about this, and I thought, can it be that I, a bourgeois gentleman, you know, from a long heritage of West Texas family, has become a very scary anarchist? Is this possible? I feel very normal. Anarchism seems kind of inevitable and a little bit common sense. It seems wise to me. It seems intelligent. And yet, I don't think the world agrees with me, but I can't resist this conclusion. So I went up to Murray and I said this. I just put the proposition to him that this is what I've come to believe. And does this make me an anarchist? He said, yes, Jeffrey, of course it makes you an anarchist. And I said, well, then I think I am one. And he jumped forward about 5 feet, forward as he could do, and grabbed my hand and he said, you know, welcome, Jeffrey, to anarchism. And I thought at that moment, I thought, you know, I can, now that this has happened, I can never not be an anarchist. I'm stuck for life. You know, as they say about, you know, some of the more robust religions, it's like burnished on your soul forever. So I've been carried that sense around, you know, for forever. But I look now at libertarians, and so often what I find is not a joy and a love of life, but I see a kind of sadness or an anger that leads to an anti-intellectual sort of nihilism. And I think it's dangerous, and I understand why. I mean, you know, you become an anarchist, and then you join, you know, anarchist Facebook groups, and all you get every single second is pictures of cops beating people, terrible things happening in war, ghastly things happening around the world. You're mortified, you're horrified, and filled with outrage at all the injustice in the world, and it begins to get depressing after a while. And then it gets even worse once you decide that you want to do something about it. And so you decide to write an article, or a post, or a tweet, and you explain that the minimum wage does not actually boost employment or wages, it actually harms the poor. And the welfare state just creates dependency and robs us of charity, and that our wars are actually creating more enemies, and that actually we should legalize drugs because that would allow us to handle the drug problem better than the state. And you explain this to people, and strangely, it's the strangest thing, you explain it, and then nothing happens. Like, the policies don't change. I mean, you have explained it to the world. You have shown the world the truth. And yet, there's nothing that seems to be happening as a result of your efforts. And it gets a little bit frustrating. I'm not sure at what point, I think when you're in college, you come to believe that whatever you think whatever is in your head is going to dictate the shape of the world in the future. At some point, you realize that that's not true, and that the state itself, it turns out to not want to move at all. It's like this gigantic obstacle in your path, and it's not moving, and you're screaming at it, and it's not moving. And that gets depressing. So you wonder, what is the point of my belief structure? I'm mad as hell. I've been screaming about this terrible thing called government. Government's not doing anything, and I'm making everybody mad at me. And now I've made a lot of enemies, and they hate me. What am I going to do? What am I going to do with my life? I've done all these books. Jesus, have you seen my book collection? I spent endless hours on reading, arriving at these views, and yet I can't seem to figure out what I'm going to do with it. And so you eventually decide that the only real solution to your predicament is to attack all the other libertarians, actually. Since they're the only people really listening to you. So you decide to get involved in faction fights, and I think that explains basically the last 10 years of libertarianism. So I'd like to back up just a little bit and reorient where we are and who we are as libertarians. And I think the best way to do this is to back up and examine the origins of the term itself. I don't know how often you think about this term libertarian. See, I think it's a little bit clinical. I understand why we have to have it, and I understand why we use it. We're stuck with it, and we're going to do it. I think it's a little bit clinical. It's got too many syllables. It's a little bit unusual. And also, gosh, I get so tired of the debates about who is and isn't a libertarian, and who is and isn't ruining libertarianism. I get exhausted of this kind of stuff. And I think one of the ways we can learn to break out of this paradigm is just by revisiting the origin of the term. So let's just go, and I've done a little research on this, because I was very curious when this term came about. Now you have to go back to actually Murray's early years in the movement, as we call it, in the post-war period of America. This generation of thinkers that emerged out of World War II, a very strange, dark period in our times. We had the New Deal, which messed up everything. It brought us to corporate state and led to some just unending ghastly things. And then plunged straight into World War II, where we had massive central planning, wage controls. Even to get flour or lard at the store, you had to have a ration coupon, where men were being drafted and killed, and everything you heard from the news was pure propaganda. Very difficult time. So this generation came out of World War II, a generation of intellectuals, and I'm thinking about people like Albert J. Nock in his later years, who Murray knew very well. Frank Chodorow, who was the son of some Ashkenazi immigrants who had been working for Human Events and a great, essayist. Ayn Rand was coming into her own as a novelist. And the American Institute for Economic Research had already been established by A.C. Harwood, who was out advocating for sound money in the United States. And Ludwig von Mises had just immigrated from Geneva in 1940, and Hayek, I guess at that period, was teaching in London. So we had quite a number of very interesting intellectuals extant, but they had a major problem that they didn't know what to call themselves. And so there were a number of terms thrown around. One was individualist, right? That was, I think, Frank Chodorow's favorite. It's an interesting word, and I don't dislike it entirely. But it didn't seem to be the thing that had a broad common appeal. So there was this guy, and suddenly his name slips mind. Dean Russell. Dean Russell. Did you know Dean Russell? You did? Translator of Bastiat, right? So he writes this article in 1956. He goes, "We all know what we are. We are liberals. We're liberals. That's what we've always been. 500 years of liberalism. It used to mean something. But something weird has happened in the United States, and it began to happen in World War I, but it really began to happen after the New Deal came along. All the old liberals began to make their compromises with the corporate state. And liberalism became something different from what it used to be. Everybody knew in the 19th century what liberalism was. But here we are after World War II, and we can't even use our own word anymore without people misunderstanding what we're talking about, said Dean Russell. So he said, I propose a new term. And it's not exactly new, it's not a new term, it's not neologism, it's not a new word in English. It just hasn't been used in a long time. It was left over from the late 19th century, mostly socialist anarchists, they called themselves libertarians. But nobody has really used this term since like World War I. It's dead, it's really kind of gone missing. So I propose that we take it over. Let's call ourselves libertarian. Now, what is the difference between libertarianism and liberalism of the old sort? Nothing. It's the same thing, all right? It's just that we can't call ourselves liberals anymore. But now we're going to call ourselves libertarians. But this is not an innovation in thought. This is just a perfect synonym, all right? So I'm quoting to you this 1956 article by Dean Russell. The origin of the post-war use of the term libertarian is rooted in the belief that it was a synonym for the word liberalism. Now, I think that's important for us to understand. Because what it does two things, I think, if we think of ourselves as liberals. One is, it gives us much deeper roots than perhaps we thought we had. A lot of times I think libertarians think we were founded in 1972 with the Libertarian Party, or maybe in 1973 with the appearance of Court and Liberty, or maybe Atlas Shrugged made us that, I don't know, or maybe Ron Paul did this for us. Libertarianism is just, a couple of decades old, or maybe it just came about in the last few years when I joined my libertarian Facebook group or subreddit, But the truth is that our history goes way back to 500 years. That is our personality. That is our aesthetic. That is our ambition. That is our aspiration, to be liberals like this great tradition. It's not identified with one single thinker, although it tends to be primarily, and I think correctly, associated with the Scottish Enlightenment, with the works of Adam Smith and David Hume. But it's not exclusively that. I think that most probably embodies the spirit, because it was Adam Smith that sort of wedded that commercial ethos to a traditional liberalism. The real roots of it go back much deeper, and I want to talk about that here a little bit. Let me give you a second case for why it's important for us to think of ourselves as liberals. Because it takes us out of the American context and lets us think of ourselves as part of a more global movement that includes everywhere on the earth where there has been a liberal movement. Spain, Germany, France, Latin America. In every language, there is a word for liberalism. Liberalisme, liberalismus, libertate, what's some other examples of the language? All from the Latin root. Calling ourselves liberals helps us understand what other people are aspiring to achieve and helps us think of ourselves as part of a global movement with deep roots. As long as we think of ourselves as libertarians, we're suddenly playing around with a post-war neologism that belongs to American political context, and that's a problem. I mean, the word libertarian doesn't mean anything anywhere in the world like what it means here. And even in most parts of the world, the word liberal means exactly what you and I mean by libertarian, or at least approximately like that. So I wish we could take it back. We can't reverse this history. In fact, I wasn't there. I wasn't in the position of having to make this decision that Dean Russell did. However, by the way, maybe somebody can help me. Who was the great liberal thinker who was actually at the Bolshevik Revolution? He was an American intellectual.
Max Eastman?
Max Eastman. Wow, you didn't know him, did you? No, you didn't know Max Eastman.
I didn't know him, no.
No, okay. I actually once, Max Eastman, wow. What, have you read this? Have you ever read, Max Eastman's amazing. I was trying to reprint one of his books one time and I found out the rights belonged to his wife. And I saw that she lived in New York and I thought, surely not. I called her on the phone, she said, I said, wait, is this Max Eastman's widow? She said, well, yes, it is. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I was actually speaking to her. I asked her if I could reprint her husband's work. She said, no, absolutely not. Anyway, that was my one contact with Max Eastman. Anyway, Max Eastman was also involved in this decision to adopt the term libertarian. I don't know. It's very easy for us to sit in this room and go, they should have fought the good fight. They should have stuck with it. They shouldn't have given up the term liberalism. It's our word. It's our tradition. It's our history. They can't take it from us. So I wish they had done that, but I wasn't there at the time. I don't know. I've noticed, by the way, that have you figured this out, that the Social Democrats and the Socialists and the left, as we call them today, have more or less given up the term liberalism. Now they call themselves progressives, right? So my view is, look, if you don't want it, can we have it back? You know. So let's look back at the origin of liberalism, so that we can understand a little bit about where it came from. I'm a little bit embarrassed that I don't. Okay, so I'm showing that it's top of the hour right now. So I've got, I don't know how much time I was given here.
You got 30 minutes.
Okay, so I'll take 50 minutes over the question. So, liberalism. Why was it born, and what was it born out of? Historians explain to us that it really comes down, that it gradually unfolded beginning with one insight that was gradually applied to other areas of life. The core insight had to do with religion and the religious wars. Because it was widely believed throughout the Middle Ages that you could not have a coherent society unless you had homogeneous belief about religion. That everybody had to ascribe to a certain dogma if the social order was to function properly. And if you permitted people to deviate from that, then you would not only threaten the regime and the coherence and structure and orderliness of society, but you would endanger souls, right? So if, for example, you made the mistake of believing in consubstantiation instead of transubstantiation, you might go to hell, or the reverse, depending on who was in charge of telling you what you had to believe, right? And of course, this reached monumental, epic, absurd proportions in English history when Henry detached his own church structure from the authority of the Pope, but attempted to retain the fullness of Catholic doctrine, but gradually saw it kind of mutate over the following 40 years, as he couldn't find many people to go along with him. And so the teaching, the dogma is changing on a daily basis. So that, it was just as likely that people who were loyal to the Pope were going to be hung on the same day as people that were loyal to the new radical Protestant and individualist religions at the time. So it became a very dicey period, especially after the Reformation. At some point, the religious wars became so costly for everyone involved. The question was raised, what if we have a new system? And it goes something like this. You can believe whatever you want as long as you don't impose your belief on somebody else, and you leave everybody else alone, and you're not fundamentally trying to overthrow the government, let's just add that proviso in there, then let's just have religious liberty. Let's just try it out and see if it works. It sounds like the worst imaginable thing, heterogeneous religious belief in society. But let's just try it out and see if it works. And it turns out it did work. And in fact, it flourished. And the religious wars ended, and the social suffering ended, and the burning of heretics came to an end, which even great early liberal thinkers like Thomas Aquinas thought the state should pretty much stick to only adjudicating real crimes against person and property, except, of course, you got to burn heretics. Everybody knows that, right? Yeah. So gradually the idea that it was the state's job to burn heretics went away, And oh my God, who can believe it? It actually worked. Religions could coexist. That was an amazing revelation. That was the birth of liberalism. That was the birth of this idea that there's an aspect of life that society can manage better than any authority. If we get authority out of the way, it turns out you get better results. Everyone's happier. People can live more peaceful lives. You can have better evidence of social progress, and without so much godforsaken trauma all the time, and people dangling from ropes and heads lopping off all over the place. This is horrible. Bloodshed is terrible. So let's try this. And it turns out that that was the birth of liberalism, and then it was gradually unfolded over the decades. And it began to be applied to things like speech. Why don't we try the same thing with speech? What if we let you just say what you want? How about this? You can write what you want. You can publish whatever you want. You can trade whatever you want. You can even trade outside the national borders. Imagine that. Now that, even today, apparently is controversial. If you watched the State of the Union the other night. You can live wherever you want. You can travel. You can go from place to place. You can pick a place to live on your own without having to register your address. And all throughout the 16th century, you began to see these migration patterns that were growing. And then you saw the rise of the Medicis, and commercial life began to unfold. And you began to see the rise of banking institutions, and capital really began to mean something. And structures of production began to grow out. And people who once were born into a single role in life and were told that they could never progress out of that role, began to experience in their lives something like choice and progress, and incredibly and remarkably, they began to make money. Money was freedom, because money is liquid. Money meant that you could make choices. It wasn't just vegetables and a little bit of piece of rotten meat and a place to live and one piece of clothing that you had to wear all of your life and then pass on to your kids. No, that's not how you were paid. If you moved to the right place and get a new job, you could get paid in money and use that money to spend on whatever you wanted. And that flipped the whole narrative of history. Suddenly, the productive agents in society turned from just serving the elites, now are serving the common person who's carrying around the spending power. So all of history began to change completely. We flipped everything. The hierarchies began to die. And the previously stuck, disempowered, marginalized groups began to rise and ascend and have children and make new choices, and progress began to be born all throughout the 16th century. And you can hear it in the music. The difference between anything composed in, say, 1450 and anything composed in 1550 anywhere in Europe is like night and day. One is dark and severe and difficult and a little primitive sounding. The other is flourishing and aspirational and beautiful and luxurious and hopeful and full of joy, with a bright outlook on the future of life. And it was true in the architecture, and it was true in the painting, and it's true in the literature, and it transformed life on earth because we began to get a vision of a good life, thanks entirely to a new belief, the belief that society can manage itself better than any authority structure can manage it. That is the essence of liberalism. And it was glorious. And you can see it in the demographic data over the following 2 centuries, with the rise of banking and commercial trading and shipping And the migrations to the cities, and people, you know, when they became of age, looked at their lives and said, look at me. I can be great. I can do something wonderful. I can become something wonderful. I can fall in love with someone of my own choosing, and we can make a beautiful life together anywhere we want. There is opportunity. There's now possibility, all because of liberalism. And you look at the demographic data during what some people, what is called the Belle Époque, which is, you know, what Mises called the age of laissez-faire, between the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but finally the last shitty wars in Europe came to an end, and we had a beautiful period from about 1810 all the way up to about 1913, in which we had the biggest explosion of prosperity and liberty all over the world. And for God's sake, it's unbelievable to think about what happened in that one century. Slavery came under the question. It's very, very controversial, right? Since the ancient world, everybody knew you needed slaves. God knows what would happen in a world without slaves, right? Am I wrong, David?
You're wrong.
Sure.
Thraldom is abolished in Iceland, and I think in the 11th or 12th century.
Okay.
And you don't have much slavery as opposed to serfdom in the European Middle Ages. You're giving a cartoon version of the Middle Ages.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, I'm thinking about England and the United States. And particularly the works of Thomas Carlyle, which is what was in my mind. So I'm not thinking about Iceland, and I think I knew that there was not a great deal of slavery in Middle Ages in Europe, right? Okay. But Carlyle, right? So he's imagining a possibility of a world without slavery. Unthinkable. He thinks it's dreadful and horrifying. It goes away anyway. And in the United States, the cause of women's rights suddenly becomes something that people have imagined, that maybe the only normative human beings are not men, that all human beings deserve rights. I mean, incredible. And it was a beautiful thing, and it unfolded gloriously. But there were movements afoot during the 19th century that began to threaten liberalism from two ends. And I think we're aware, very aware, of one of those. And it's called socialism, right? The origins of socialism we could talk about all day, go back to the ancient world. But in the 19th century in particular, Mises and actually Murray Rothbard both trace it to a faction of Hegelianism. Now, as much as I would like to take some time to talk about Hegelianism here, I think it might be a mistake. I think it's important to think of the history of ideas in the 19th century and the revolt against liberalism as embodying two general camps of Hegelians, left and right. I take this insight from a lecture that Mises gave in 1959. The right Hegelians, following Hegel himself and his students, believed that there was a sweep of history that took place independent of human action. That there was like a cap H history that was driving us forward to some sort of culminating moment. And that moment was culminating in the rule by the Prussian state and the Prussian church, in a situation in which the state was absolutely primary and godlike. The left Hegelians went a different direction with the same thing, believing in the same Hegelian view of history, but thinking it was going to be a universal transformation of all humankind, and that that history itself would lead to a great collective age of the spirit. All right. So these are the two sources of revolt, and two sources of revolt against laissez-faire. It turns out a lot of people were very interested, particularly the elites, were very interested in one or two of these branches of revolt against liberalism. And why is that? This is something I've never understood, or I didn't understand until I started doing the study for the last couple of years. The demographic changes that came about as a result of the success of liberal capitalism in the late 19th century sent many elites into a panic. What kind of future are we going to have in which our children are allowed to move wherever they want, where our daughters can marry anyone they want, when the family no longer stays intact under a single homestead, where the peasants of 50 years ago are now the rich capitalists of today, where the wrong people are propagating themselves, right? Where society's productive resource is not going to exclusively to providing art for the elites, but rather are dedicated to mass popular novels to be bought by every common person. Now, this sent a lot of elite intellectuals into a kind of panic and drew them to these anti-liberal ideas of either the left or the right. I think as libertarians, we tend to be very aware of the left socialist revolt against laissez-faire in the works of Marx. We're less aware of the right Hegelian revolt against liberalism that took the form in the works of Friedrich List, for example, the great trade theorist of Germany who moved to the United States and convinced a whole generation of economists that we should embrace protectionism, for example. I mean, it's very interesting to me to hear the other night Donald Trump, in his inaugural address, basically repeating a bunch of cliches from Friedrich List's 1841 book, whatever, The Theory of National Economy. I mean, it's unbelievable how ideas can be ported over time, and you can tell me, well, Donald Trump never read Friedrich List. Yeah, but the typical SJW protester on the street hasn't read Marx either, right? This is the way ideas move through history. So the left and the right both have been a revolt against liberalism for a very long time. We're seeing now the ascendance of this right-wing revolt against liberalism as a reaction to the power of the left as it has emerged over the last 25 years. My newest book, Right-Wing Collectivism, The Other Threat to Liberty, discusses this entirely and traces its origins from 1820 all the way through List and Carlyle and the early eugenics movement, all the way through to Carl Schmitt and the interwar years of fascism in Germany and Italy and Spain and the United States, all the way up to the works of Julius Baron von Abula, who is the favorite thinker of our friend Steve Bannon, who was mercifully driven out of the White House only very recently. So this stuff is still alive. It's still alive. What is the role of libertarianism, or liberalism, as I prefer to call it? We have to provide a coherent alternative to the left and right. I don't think that either versions of these authoritarian, totalitarian systems that we're being offered today have much of a future. The left, at this stage in history, is intellectually incoherent. Their plans haven't worked. The last great federal program inspired by the social democratic left was Obamacare. It fell apart in disgrace. I don't know if any president's ever going to attempt anything like that again. But there's even more fundamental problems with the left. The big one is that they're positing a vision of society that's no longer even possible. They want a cradle-to-grave welfare state with massive government control over everybody's lives, with very high taxation and paternalistic loving care, and with a population that believes that the government is serving us. Well, there's a problem with that. That presumes that all of society works like a homogeneous family, Well, you can't believe in that vision of society and also believe in diversity. You just can't. In a society like ours, people don't like a state that's serving people unlike themselves. I mean, it's a kind of a grim truth, but it's absolutely a truth. The conflict between wanting a welfare state on one hand and also at the same time wanting maximum diversity in society, those are they're clashing in the left-wing view, and it's just not going to work for them electorally or otherwise. Social democratic parties all over Europe have been declining now for 30 years, and I don't believe there's going to be much of a future to it. But then you look at somebody like Donald Trump, who I think represents a kind of right-wing revolt against liberalism, and you wonder what that is all about too. You heard his lecture the other night, this State of the Union address, which advanced a nationalism the likes of which I haven't heard really in my lifetime. I mean, just a pure ideological nationalism, a vision of hell, a vision of heaven, and a method for getting from one place to the other. But it's a strange nationalism because he also is extremely personally resentful against all the forces in Washington that can actually bring about the nationalism he wants to achieve. He doesn't like the deep state. He doesn't like the bureaucracies. He doesn't care a flipping anything about the Department of Labor and the Department of State and HUD and the EPA and all the rest of these people. Some people say this new book, Fire and Fury, has a hilarious remark. Why isn't he appointed all these offices? Because he only cares about the people that are in front of him. When people come up to him and say, listen, dude, we've got to appoint the Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs of the State Department. He's like, what? Who's that guy? I don't need that. Sounds ridiculous. Get out of my face. So he's not a very good nationalist. I think what Trump wants is a personal state, not really a traditional nation state. He wants a Trump state. I'm sorry, but that ain't going to happen. We're going into a period where we have these intractable political divisions. Media hates Trump, and the red states hate blue states. Everybody's like, oh, isn't that terrible? You know what? It's great. If you read something like the great book, How the West Grew Rich, what you find out is that liberty in the Middle Ages and liberalism itself came about not because any one great thinker advanced it or proposed it or imposed it. No one great statesman implemented liberty. Liberty came about because there were so many people vying for power that they were competing with each other, and therefore no one was able to get it fully. And the result was a decentralization and a diffusion of power, and the results were liberty itself, right? I look at the 21st century as retracing that history in many ways, and I think it's good. The more political divisions we have, the better off we are. The more the media hates Trump, Trump hates the media, the State Department hates the FBI hates HUD, the red states hates blue stuff, the less chance there is for there to be any kind of centralization or consolidation of power. This is all good, my friends. But what is it lacking? And this is where I think libertarianism really comes into play here. One paradigm is collapsing. I think we're seeing that. We are entering into what Thomas Kuhn calls a pre-paradigmatic state. In other words, nobody knows what the hell to do now, right? Liberalism, libertarianism, we offer an answer. It's a very simple proposition. Society can manage itself better than the government can manage itself, better than the government can manage us. Does that message have resonance? In 1962, something like 65% of the American people trusted the government to do the right thing. Can you imagine? Today, 18%. That is an epic change. It's our opportunity. It's our opportunity to speak not with wild populist agitation, anger, and mass rallies and all this nonsense, but with, as Muse said, clarity, rationality, coherence, make sense, be calm. But above all, my friends, look back to the example of Murray Rothbard and the example he gave me in my life. This man loved life. He felt joy about liberty. He looked forward to a bright future. It's what gave him his reason for existence. It's why he got up in the morning. It's why he wrote everything he wrote. And because of his personality and just the force of who he was, his love of life, he forged a movement. Let's set aside our dreariness. Forget the darkness. Let's look forward to a beautiful future. Attract people to this glorious vision of a flourishing society all over the world. A world of universal human dignity and human rights. Can we talk that way? Can we think that way? I think we should. And if we do, I think we can win. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Jeffrey Tucker.
Do we have any time? I used it all, didn't I?
No, you have time for a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
You have 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, 5 minutes, great. Yes, Charles.
When we keep losing words like liberalism, it strikes me that we're going to lose our definition of the term libertarianism
Yeah.
at this juncture. Do you think
Yeah,
that's,
I agree. I worry about the term libertarian. I really do, because I've got a lot of personal investment in it. We've got a party around it. But these days, it's not entirely clear what it means anymore. It's very mixed up, and I'm concerned about it. It's also a failing of language. We're never going to find the right word. Everybody's always looking for the right term. We were talking earlier about, voluntarism. We're never going to find the right word. And when Mises wrote his 1929 book, Liberalismus in German, it came out in the United States in an English translation, and there was a new title given to it called The Free and Prosperous Commonwealth. Do you remember this? And then the second edition came out, and Mises, now a very old man, said, you know what? That new title you gave it, it sucks. I'm not one of those guys that gets all attached definitions and stuff, but I'm going to make one exception, liberalism. This book is called liberalism. There is no other word that can replace it. This word must stay. So that was the second edition of the book. That's why he called it that. Yeah. I think we have a chance to explain that libertarianism is not just some weird, new, arcane, clinical ideology, but really is the liberalism that built modernity. That I think the word can work as long as we can explain it. Yes, go ahead.
This positive effort that you're talking about should be applied where? I mean, where do you think it is? Politics? Is it economics? Is it is it a single issue? I mean,
I think
I
think it can be applied everywhere. I honestly do. I think it can be applied everywhere. I try to do it myself, and I think probably everybody in this room has gone through waves in which you felt nothing but anger, and it's led you to a dark place. I know it happened to me, but if you can dig your way out of that and just adopt that, what I consider to be the Rothbardian outlook, that joy, that sense of love, and convey that in your writings and in your speeches and in politics, I don't think there's one way to advance liberty. We all have a role, every one of us, in our own lives, in whatever way that is. Maybe it's just, the way you raise your children. That doesn't mean they have to become libertarians, but but that sense of love of life you have and that love of liberty, it will be passed on to them. And the way you conduct your personal life and your friendships and your professional life, and I think it can pervade everything you do. And I think it's more valuable and more lasting than attempting to cobble together mass movements. I think we've tried that, and I don't think it worked well. I think the way we're going to change the culture is by making sense in whatever way we can. Okay? Yes, David. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I said something wrong.
Lots of points we can discuss later, but I just thought I'd stick to two for the moment.
Okay.
First, the idea that sort of money payments and trade
Yes.
started in the 16th century. The Hanseatic League starts in the 12th century. Through the Middle Ages, in Christian, Muslim, and Jewish societies, people are working out legal formulas to get around the prohibition on interest in all. That was first point. Second point.
Are you talking about Spain during the Concordancia, or what?
No, I'm talking about Muslim law, Christian law, and Jewish law, where you've got the Christians using a formula for evading it, which they have borrowed from the Muslims, keeping their version of the Arabic name of it. Second unrelated point, and that is you say that the last 10 years of libertarianism are explained by libertarians fighting liberty. This is been going on for at least the 50 years I've been involved. your friend Murray Rothbard was heavily engaged in it. He fought Ayn Rand, he fought the Koch brothers. You can give lots of other examples.
Yeah.
It really goes back further. If you go back to Ayn Rand's attack on the pamphlet that Stigler and Friedman wrote against
Rent control.
against rent control, where she says that they're kinks for making the wrong arguments against rent control. This is a very, very old thing. I realize you're a young man.
No.
When
Say that more.
When I was a college senior, I was campaigning for Barry Goldwater.
You know, I think back at those old New York factions at the time. You know, what is it? And Judaism, it's called, you have your shul, right? Shul. So Rand had her shul, right? And Murray wanted a shul too. And he got one. He was the rabbi, right? And so on it went. And wow, and that was before the internet. You'd think that today, with the internet, it would help be a happy community.
It's easier, you can have a dispersed group and still have your own little.
The shuls become digital, right? They're Facebook groups. That's great.
What are your thoughts about the idea that this freedom also allows for the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction?
The freedom allows for the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I think it's the state that allows for proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I've thought about this a lot. I mean, if society had anything to do with it, I don't think there would be any nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. I mean, there is such disgust and horror about nuclear weapons that exists in all levels of society, in all countries, in all times, in all places. I mean, nuclear weapons are stuff of the state. If we got rid of the state, I think we'd just
Al-Qaeda doesn't want nuclear weapons?
No, yeah, but Al-Qaeda is also fighting the states. I mean, these are all, there's no simple answer to that, all right? But Al-Qaeda was a creation of the state. It was. I mean, its history goes back to even my childhood. In fact, I met many early members of Al-Qaeda because they were being invited by Republican congressmen to come to Washington to accept their gifts of tax dollars. In the 1980s, they were called freedom fighters, actually. Very strange. I went up on the elevator with one of these guys one time. Was invited to a luncheon. Again, I think I was 7 years old. I got to the elevator, this very strange man. He had a weird headdress, and I think had a knife on him, all kind of strange garb. And I'm all tolerant and everything, but I tell you, I couldn't wait to get out of the elevator because the air was getting very thick. And I got up to the 8th floor of the house, mucky muck office of yada yada, to go to a luncheon that was being put on by, I don't know, the Republican caucus of something or other. And I was startled to discover he was the luncheon speaker. And he was a leading member of the Freedom Fighters. And he got up and he said some things that sounded to me like he was wanting holy war. But the translator assured us that the speaker just said he believes in free enterprise, traditional values, and a strong national defense. It really happened. Anyway, that has to be the last question, but thank you, sir, and thank all of you.